It's too scary sleeping in this house of horrors. In March 2019, the Maine police received communication on the disappearance of 20-year-old Judy Benson and her boyfriend Carlos Dickinson. They were last seen visiting an old house on the state border. Investigators who arrived at the scene didn't find anyone. All they found was a strange door with a recorded audio message. It was Judy's voice, and she was asking for help. She had received the doll in the mail a few months before her disappearance. It was a gift from her grandmother, who Judy hadn't seen since she was a child. Mrs. Benson was not someone you would typically call a nice person. It was not surprising that even her own son, Judy's father, stopped speaking with her. After he passed away, any contact with Mrs. Benson disappeared entirely. Now, suddenly, there was this unexpected gift, a doll that could play back voice recordings. Judy pressed the button and heard her grandmother's voice.
Judy, I love you and I miss you very much.
It was very strange, but somehow nice to hear. Judy was flooded with childhood memories, back when things had been better. She remembered how she had visited her grandmother in her big old house. She smelled the same strange smells that had filled the home. Her grandmother's gift made everything come back to her. Carlos didn't like the doll for some reason. He felt a strange aura emanating from it, and would shudder every time he heard Mrs. Benson's creaky voice. But Judy didn't want to part with the doll, and always kept it close. Then, something unexpected happened. One day, Judy received an official document informing her that Mrs. Benson had passed away. That wasn't a particularly big shock for Judy. It looked like her grandmother had felt her end was near, and wanted to record a final message for her granddaughter in a doll. What really surprised Judy was that she had inherited her grandmother's house and the surrounding property. And that was very convenient because Judy was having a hard time making ends meet. Without thinking much about it, Judy decided to head to her grandmother's house and prepare it for sale. Carlos went with her. He only asked her not to bring the creepy doll, but Judy couldn't part from her grandmother's gift. After a couple of days, they turned up at the entrance of the old house. It was very moldy and dilapidated after many years of disrepair. Judy realized that a lot of work would have to be done. The selling value of the house depended on how much they could improve it. They went inside and unpacked their things. Judy felt as if nothing had changed in the last 15 years. The house would have seemed scary and ominous to anyone else, but it felt very dear to Judy's heart. Carlos wandered in and out of the rooms, anxiously inspecting everything in them. He then said, "I don't like this tomb. Let's just leave now." But Judy couldn't renounce her inheritance that easily. Anyway, she didn't think that her grandmother's house was terrible at all. But on their first night there, Judy realized that something wasn't right. While falling asleep, she suddenly heard the distinct sound of someone's footsteps in the house. Getting out of bed and lighting the way with her phone, Judy made her way through the darkness. But the house fell silent once again. Only the doll's glass eyes were watching her from the table. She must have heard the old floorboards creaking. Judy went back to bed and soon fell asleep, but not for long. She woke up with the feeling that someone was close by. When she opened her eyes, she almost screamed in surprise. The doll was sitting right in front of Judy, staring at her.
Judy, I love you and miss you very much.
The doll said suddenly, even though Judy hadn't pressed its button. What's happening? How did it end up on the bed? Carlos was sleeping beside her but didn't stir at her grandmother's voice, which rang out very clearly in the silence of the house. Judy grabbed the door and took it to another room. Something was clearly wrong with it. It was starting to scare Judy. Putting the door on the fridge, Judy then blocked the fridge door with a heavy table. She sat on the bed and stared into the darkness for the rest of the night. She saw some strange shadows, and it seemed as if she could hear scratching sounds from inside the fridge. She wasn't able to fall asleep until morning. It was already bright outside when Judy woke up. She immediately wanted to tell Carlos about everything that had happened throughout the night, but his bed was empty. He wasn't in the other rooms either. He had just disappeared. Judy decided that he must have gone to a store and waited for him to return. What was all that last night? What happened to that strange doll? Walking into the dining room, she stopped, as if rooted to the ground. Her grandmother's gift was sitting on the table right in front of her. It was smiling at her, looking her straight in the eyes. How did the doll get out of the fridge? Did Carlos take it out? But he hates touching it. Judy picked up the doll thoughtfully and accidentally pressed it, but nothing happened. At first. Then, the doll giggled creepily and said,
It will be over soon, Judy. I'm taking you with me.
Judy felt a shiver run down her spine. She dropped the accursed doll. Why hadn't she heard those words before, and what did they mean? In that moment, the doll almost seemed alive. Its eyes sparkled and looked at Judy with a sneer. This plastic toy has someone inside of it. Completely terrified, Judy grabbed the doll and ran out of the house. With a swing of her arm, Judy threw the doll down a ravine. She still couldn't believe what was happening. What's going on with this house? Carlos still wasn't back, so Judy decided to go ahead and inspect the house. Gathering her grandmother's things, she found some strange objects that she hadn't noticed before. There were dry herbs, some type of animal bones, and a book in an unknown language. What was Mrs. Benson doing here? Judy accidentally dropped her phone and bent down to pick it up, when suddenly she saw something under the bed. Something strange. She pushed the bed aside with some difficulty and immediately jumped back. Strange symbols had been drawn onto the floor. Judy didn't understand what they meant, but felt something evil emanating from the drawings. Maybe these symbols were the reason she couldn't sleep last night and dreamt of all those horrible things. This is really too much. Plus, Carlos is probably lost somewhere, and it got dark outside. A thunderstorm was approaching. Carlos should have returned a while ago. Judy called him again. Long beeps. Why isn't he answering her calls? But what's that? She heard a phone ringing from somewhere deep within the house. Judy immediately recognized the ringtone. She was hearing her boyfriend's phone. She was gripped by a terrible sense of foreboding. She continued calling, trying to find the source of the sound, and she eventually found it. Carlos's ringtone was coming from the basement. She carefully descended the freaky staircase, expecting to see something terrifying, and she saw it. Flashes of lightning outside the window revealed her boyfriend's body, lying motionless on the basement floor. His phone was still ringing next to him, but Carlos could no longer answer it. Judy was so scared she couldn't even scream. Who had done this to her boyfriend? She knew that she could no longer stay in this house of horrors. She had to get out of here and run away as far as possible. She got out of the basement with shaky legs and rushed to the door. Suddenly, she saw the doll standing in her way. A flash of lightning lit up the sinister smile and unblinking gaze, directed right at Judy. Judy stepped back. How did the doll get back into the house?
It will be over soon, Judy. I'm taking you with me,
said the old lady's creaky voice. Judy felt more afraid than she had ever been in her life. She felt that she would soon end up in the damp basement next to Carlos. Run! Right now! Judy rushed to the other door, leading into the backyard. A second later, she was about to jump out of the house, when suddenly, she saw that damned doll again. It was blocking her path. Impossible! This has to be some sort of nightmare.
It will be over soon, Judy. I am taking you with me.
Judy's head spun. She rushed up to the second floor of the damned house, hoping to get out through the window. Somewhere behind her, she heard the footsteps of small, plastic legs. It all felt like a scary dream. The doll appeared right in front of the window. The path was cut off. Judy realized in horror that she won't be getting out of this house. Her strength started to leave her. She ran to the furthest room in the house and hid in an old closet. Her heart was pounding like crazy. Judy listened close to even the tiniest rustle in the house. But strangely, all was quiet. Too afraid to move, she waited. A few minutes passed, but nothing happened. Only thunder rumbled occasionally outside the window. Judy didn't know what to do. She was frozen in fear and couldn't even consider leaving her hideout. That is how the hours went by. The house was quiet and Judy's eyes began to close gradually. She hadn't slept in almost 2 days, and all this fear had made her exhausted. Judy started falling asleep. Almost asleep, she suddenly heard a rustle. But she already knew she wouldn't be able to resist whatever came next. The last thing she remembered were the footsteps of the small doll legs, coming closer and closer. Then darkness fell. When Judy woke up, she couldn't understand where she was. It was daytime, and the sun was shining brightly through the window. She was sitting on the bed and felt strange. Judy couldn't move. She saw her arms and legs in front of her and wanted to scream in horror, but she couldn't. They were doll limbs. Fear and despair overcame her. Somehow she had ended up inside that same doll. She suddenly realized that she would never get out of it. The door of the room opened and Judy walked in. She was seeing herself. How in the hell? That was her body, but someone else was in it. "I told you that I'd take you," someone said with her voice. And suddenly she recognized it. She barely caught the intonations. That was her grandmother. Judy wanted to scream at the top of her lungs at what was happening, but instead, all she could hear was the voice recording of the cursed doll.